On the 24th of November 1946, the most infamous serial killer in history was born. In the early hours of January the 24th, 1989, he was executed in the electric chair. Ted Bundy needs little introduction. This is one of the most successful murderers, if you can use that word, there's ever been. A terrifyingly organized and calculating criminal who used his knowledge of law and police process to evade capture for years. Bundy killed at least 20 people before it became clear that countless investigations across 7 states were actually hunting the same man. His preference for blunt trauma and strangulation helped him commit his crimes unnoticed, and an obsession with physical evidence meant that fingerprints were never found at the scene. He could manipulate his features in an incredible way. Police lamented that no 2 photos of him ever looked the same. It's impossible to cover all the complexities of his violence, applying makeup to victims and posing them like magazine cover stars, his bouts of necrophilia, his obsession with youth and beauty. He was the ultimate conman, approaching women in identities ranging from firefighter to man on crutches. Today, we discuss the man who claimed to be in the enviable position of never feeling guilt. A man who confessed to 30 murders, but might actually have committed close to 100. This is Ted Bundy.
Welcome back to 30-Minute Crime. I'm Mark Williams-Thomas, and with me is Jeremy Vine. And we're talking about a case today which has captivated crime fans for many, many decades. It's an infamous case. It's the case of Ted Bundy.
Yeah, we have to cover this one because I think this is I don't imagine anyone will be as wickedly prolific as this man in our society in the way that he was, Mark, and it's worth us looking at him. It's also the case, by the way, that he was the subject of one of the best true crime books ever written by a woman called Anne Rule, who died only recently. And the reason it's extraordinary is, and this actually sets the scene quite well, is that she was in Washington in the 70s, and she was on a suicide hotline, a bit like the Samaritans. And there's a very nice young man she worked with. She became very friendly with him. And it turned out that women were going missing, and she decided, because she wanted to be a true crime writer, that she would write about these disappearances and murders. And as she looked into it and began to forage over these 4 or 5 cases, the police then said, we've got a suspect. He is called Ted and he drives a Volkswagen. And she said to her colleague on the suicide hotline, well, that's a funny thing. Your name's Ted and you drive a Volkswagen. You better watch out. She never for a second thought that the person who was doing the murder she was writing the book about was sitting next to her. And when you read that book, you see, and this is why he was so successful, horrible word to use, you see her inability to believe that it was him even after he was locked up. And that's, of course, what made him so dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, I think let's coin a phrase, the banality of evil. And I think that's a philosophy of crimes like this are committed by people who are inherently bad, who are evil. But the reality is that he is the epitome of a normal person. And so therefore, when you look at that as a philosophy, he is absolutely the banality of evil because he was a normal person who lived amongst us.
Oh, I'm going to have my first disagreement with you. I think he was abnormal. I think he was hugely, hugely wicked, ill, evil, and disrupted in a way that maybe we couldn't see on the surface. The surface looked normal, but to take an example, when his sister was 3, she woke up and he'd taken all the knives in the house and placed them around her bed like a star. And she remembered that moment and for the rest of her life thought, what was going on? And when you look at, I'm just going to mention the first killing we know about, because this is just worth us talking about. This is Linda Ann Healy. January the 4th, 1974, Bundy goes into a basement apartment in Washington, Oregon, and there's a woman in there called Karen Sparks. She's 18. He bludgeons her with a metal rod from her bed frame, sexually assaults her with the same rod, causes extensive internal injuries, ruptures her bladder. She remains unconscious for 10 days, is left with permanent brain damage, doesn't die. But in the early morning hours of February, a month later, he breaks into another basement room. 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy, undergraduate who broadcast morning radio weather reports for skiers, beat her unconscious, dressed her in blue jeans, a white blouse and boots, carried her away, raped and murdered her. And that was, we think, the first of 30, assuming he didn't strike before that. And then in the first half of 1974, female college students disappeared at the rate of 1 per month. Can you imagine? And nobody could really see him among them. I mean, where you're right,
that's the
absolutely right. Yes, exactly. He looked like everybody else. That's true.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think the banality of evil, the philosophy of that is we like to see those people as stand out. Let's over-egg it. The man in the clown, he's that individual that we can all look at and go, he's a killer. But the reality is they don't wear a cloak. They don't wear a mask. They live amongst us. They don't stand out. And I think when you look at him, hindsight's fantastic. But if we look at his upbringing, we look at his life over the period of time as a young child, he has a very, very dysfunctional early lifehood. His living with his mother and his father. He talks in terms of abuse. He says that he was abused by his father. And then we move to the position where he talks to his lawyer, where he says, actually, I committed my first murder as a teenager.
Yeah. Well, of course, he thought it was his mother and father. It was actually his grandmother and grandfather who were bringing him up while telling him that his sister was his mother. But I mean, there are lots of people who've had weird childhoods don't become serial killers. And part of it was the time in America. We need to just remember here, we didn't have forensics in the same way they do now. You were free to move around. States didn't communicate incredibly with their criminal activities or policing activities weren't wired together at all. So you could do murders in one state, move to another. The concept of the loner or the drifter wouldn't at the time attract suspicion in the same way. And probably it was the sort of society where you put on a tie and people regard you as a good boy. And, the fact that we've seen this before in our podcast, Mark, where the person committing the crimes goes to the heart of where you don't expect them to be. The classic Jimmy Savile writes a book called Stranger Danger. So Bundy worked in Washington as the assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee, where he wrote a pamphlet for women on rape prevention. Isn't that incredible?
Yeah. And what he did also, of course, is he used the network of roads to be transient in his offending behavior. So he would commit some crimes in an area when he was leaving that area. So he wasn't still in the area. And what we know about the way that offenders often operate is that they put distance between them and the crime. So the crime occurs in a certain area and they get on the road and they disappear as quickly as possible. But let's go back to that point about the early murder. So he talks about the murder of a teenager that he says was sexually orientated. And that's very key because when you look at his later crimes, they were all sexually motivated, some of them very horrifically. But let's make a comparison. And I think it's really important because when we talk in terms of serial killers, some of the largest serial killers, of course, have come from the US. But there's a real correlation between one serial killer and his behavior. And that is a guy called Robert Black, who you know well. Robert Black and the murder,
Indeed.
Of course.
Yeah.
Robert Black committed his very first offense as a young boy, as a teenager, where he committed a sexual offense. And of course, he goes on and commits lots of murders, many of which he was never prosecuted for. He's no longer alive. And I think when you commit a murder as a young teenager, that sets in a path, a course of action that is only going to go one way. And that is what he ends up doing, which is becoming a very clever killer. I mean, it pains me to say that you've got an individual like Bundy and to give him any level of credit. But he was a clever killer because actually what he did is he got away with it for such a long period of time by creating this fake profile, this image of normalness, this respectability, which gave him the edge. And of course, we know offenders do that. You've alluded to it with Jimmy Savile. There's many other offenders that put themselves in a position where we think, actually, do you know what? They wouldn't do that. They're a decent person. And he was clever as well. I mean, he was clever to such a degree that he went on the run twice. He managed twice to escape custody.
That's right. So he starts in Utah, and you have all these missing women in the Pacific Northwest. The police have got nothing except his name is Ted and he drives a Volkswagen. And they've also worked out that his way of doing it was to have his arm in a sling and remove the passenger seat of the car. And there were we know that because a couple of women who he tried to abduct and failed, he said, I've got my arm in a sling. I just need you to help me with my sailing boat. As a part of it, I need to get in the car. So that's quite a plausible story. And as they approach, they see there's no sailing boat and the passenger seat isn't in the car. By the way, the car is in a museum somewhere in the States. I mean, that's how notorious this guy is. So he commits these murders in Washington. It gets a bit hot for him there. He moves to Colorado. We then have this extraordinary thing where he's arrested in Colorado. In 1977, he says, I need to defend myself, and for that I need legal papers. So he convinces them he's got to go into the law library. He's practiced jumping off his bunk bed in jail to strengthen his ankles, and he jumps out of a second-story law library window, hides in the mountains, gets rearrested. He then, when he's back in jail, realizes there's a tiny vent in the roof. It's too small for him to fit through, so he loses 30 pounds in order to fit through it. After he escapes, people said, you know what, we heard weird noises in the roof for a few weeks. We assumed it was rats or something. It was actually Bundy just testing the escape route. He goes down to Florida, and there we get these horrific bludgeonings of students in Florida. And then the worst, I won't say the worst crime of all, but the tragedy is, as he reaches the point where he knows he'll be caught, because at last the whole of America knows this guy is the most dangerous criminal out there, he then kills a 12-year-old girl, just the final crime. He murders her. And when he talked to people, investigators, a very manipulative guy, but he put his lawyers said they thought he'd killed probably closer to 100. We know about 30. But he'd said, I'll never talk about any deaths that are close to my home or of young people. So you're ruling out any confessions to the murders of children and so on. But then he gets the electric chair, although not before conceiving. I think he had a child when he was in prison on death row. So I don't know what happened there.
Let's talk about how that happened. So he's a prisoner. He's probably one of the most dangerous prisoners, although at that stage he'd only been convicted of 3 murders, because he was denying any involvement in anything else, maintained that really until the very end. But he was allowed, and it's never properly been explained how, but there must have been some kind of leverage given to the prison officers to allow his partner to come in, someone that he'd met previously when he was working for local authority, I think it was. But he met her. She comes in and she conceives. How on earth is a convicted murderer allowed to end up being in a position where they can have sex and conceive, and subsequently has his child?
I think maybe there were conjugal rights on death row. That's all I can think. But it's a very strange one when you see they've got photos of the two of them, so whatever was happening there was allowed by the prison. I remember this story, the very end of his life was the sort of first time I really clocked him, which was in 1989 where he was executed, and I was working on the Today program on Radio 4, and it was just a brief item saying a serial killer in the States. Actually, I don't even know if we had the term serial killer in 1989, but they said he'd been executed, and I began to look into it, and I just thought, this is crazy, the stuff he's done. And actually there are many, maybe 24 different murders which he's suspected of directly, but he didn't really leave forensic trace, even though in those days they didn't have DNA profiling. So they've never really managed to say, aha, we've got Bundy on the genes of this woman who died and we never knew who it was. They've got quite a number where people retrospectively look as if they have been attacked by Bundy, not least, by the way, Debbie Harry of Blondie. I don't know if you've heard that story, but she's certain that he approached her and said, can you get in here? I've got a problem. I can't drive. I only got one arm working. And she looks and the car's only got one seat. So that's an extraordinary thing.
in the 1970s and 80s, policing was so different than it is today. An awful lot has been learned. And as a result of that, if that happened today, of course, the question we'd ask ourselves is, would he have been allowed to get away with it for so long? And would they have linked the crimes together? Because there was a real similarity between the crimes. There was particularly a similarity between what we refer to as victimology. So offenders will often choose their target, and their target may be, for example, a child between a certain age or hair color, ethnicity. But in his case, it tended to seem to stem around a rejection that he got from a young lady when he was in education. And that seemed to be his kind of like catalyst to target, which he did eventually end up targeting, which is women that tended to fit into that category and identity of the lady that spurned him. And I think as a result of that, that was his drive, really. And his point is, of course, would he have stopped? I mean, we will never know. And this is often the case with serial killers. Peter Tobin, Angus Sinclair, we'll never know exactly how many they killed, because there's always a caveat. I'll tell you what I want to tell you, but I'm not going to tell you everything. And in this case, Bundy said, well, I'll tell you some stuff, but I'm not going to tell you everything. So that number could be considerably more than what we know. And what we do know, of course, in America is there's an incredible amount of unsolved murders. And it wasn't as though he committed his murders in one state. He was moving all over the place.
Yeah, but there was this period at the start where, and it's a bit impossible to believe that he would suddenly start up at one a month having done nothing before. But in 1974, he's not quite 30. And you get this one student a month goes missing in a relatively small area. So just let's name a couple of these victims. Roberta Kathleen Parks, age 20, leaves her dormitory at Oregon State University to have coffee with friends. The Memorial Union never arrives. Bundy later says he spotted her in the cafeteria, persuaded her to go with him to a bar. There we go. He's able to do that. And after they got into his car, he tied and gagged Parks and drove her back to Washington to be killed, raping her twice on the way. Then less than a month later, Brenda Carroll Ball, 22, leaves the Flame Tavern near the airport in Seattle, disappears, last seen in the parking lot talking to a brown-haired man with his arm in a sling. He later admitted he'd brought her back to his residence where he said they had consensual sex and he strangled her and killed her. He couldn't explain the damage done to her skull, etc. And on we go. And then we get to this particular day. If you've watched the series on this, Conversations with a Killer, the particular day, which is the most chilling of all, is July the 14th, 1974. And you have this basically almost like a bank holiday in Washington, Washington or Oregon. I think it might be Oregon, actually. The Lake Sammamish State Park in Assaquah. And this guy is going round in a white tennis outfit with his left arm in a sling, speaking with a light accent, Canadian or British, introducing himself as Ted, asking for the help of young women to unload a sailboat from his bronze-coloured Volkswagen Beetle. One accompanied him as far as his car, saw that there was no sailboat and fled. 3 additional witnesses saw Ted approach 23-year-old Janice Ann Ott. She disappeared. 4 hours later, Denise Marie Nasland, 19-year-old woman, left a picnic to go to the restroom, never returned. So the word spree is needed here. He was a killer and a hunter, and he couldn't stop.
Yeah, I mean, he targeted his victims, didn't he? But he was also, in a way, quite sporadic in terms of that, because I think he would literally, he may not set out on the day to go and target someone and then see somebody. I think he was probably one. When we think of serial killers in the 1970s and 80s, that is probably the serial killer's most optimum period of time in our generation that they were offending. And the reason being is that policing was at its worst then. We've now got motor vehicles traveling much quicker and being able to move around. So in terms of his offending, he would offend in one state. I think in 6 states, he totally offended him. But he'd offend in one state and then he'd be in his car into another state before that body was found. And in some cases, the bodies were never found. So he created this early understanding. And I think for police officers and people who study crime, they've looked at the Ted Bundy's offending and actually used it as a scenario of actually understanding how offenders operate. And what we know about serial killers and what we know about killers is they learn. And I think there are a lot of people out there that have watched into and followed in terms of how Ted Bundy not only got away with it for the start, but also subsequently ended up getting caught. And of course, his biggest downfall was the reason he got caught for the very first time before he was tried for the second time for eventually the three murders, was that his victim, or he let one of his victims accidentally go.
Carol d'Orange. Well, it's such a famous incident, this, and it's the most important thing that happened, which worked for the victims, which is that this amazing woman called Carol d'Orange was leaving a shopping centre, and a man dressed as a police officer, calling himself Officer Roseland, said, "There's been an attempt to steal your car. I need to take you to the police station to give a witness statement." And he drove her, and she got in his car, and it wasn't a police car. And she said, "This isn't the way to the police station." And she said at that moment, his eyes just went black. And he stopped the car and he started to beat her. And he made the mistake. He was trying to knock her out and he failed, and because she was fighting back. And then he got some handcuffs and he put both the ringlets of the handcuffs around the same wrist. So she stayed free and she got out. You can imagine the trauma of that, Carol d'Orange. And in the end, he had this ability to change his appearance. So there'd been 2 lineups before that where he hadn't been picked out. So the police really struggled. He was like a kind of master of disguise, or he just looked like everybody else. You just wouldn't remember his features. And in this case, as soon as she saw the lineup, and there's a photo of it, and he's dressed in an unusual way. He's trying to avoid it. She says, "That's him." And that was a major part of getting him into court the first time. So credit to her. She faced him across the courtroom. What an amazing woman. But to get, there were cases where the Yorkshire Ripper had tried and failed to kill someone. It turns out that the victim who gets away can sometimes be the thing that just jumps the investigation forwards.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think when Peter Sutcliffe, allowed his first victim to get away and she broke away from him, he lived in fear that she was going to identify him. Fortunately, she wasn't able to. But, had she been able to do that, it would be a massive difference. Of course, in this case, he was picked out in a lineup. But I think I want to make an interesting point, and I'd be interested to know what your thoughts about this are, because, and I found the piece. So in 1980, whilst he was still facing some proceedings, he married Carol Ann Boone. He'd met her when she was at the Department of Emergency Services in Washington, and they had the conjugal visits. He ended up making her pregnant, and she had a child. Subsequently, they divorced in 1986. Now, this is the question that I never, ever can understand. What is it that makes women attracted to a man who is so brutal that has taken the life of many other women? What is it that would attract a woman to go anywhere near a man like that? And we see it so often with women writing to the most brutal, horrible criminals, males in jail. Why is that?
I would not even like to answer that question, not being a woman myself, but I think leave aside the female end of it. Clearly, when this person arrives in court, that for them it's like being a rock star. That's what they think they've done. They think they've become famous. He probably thought he was successful at taking so many lives without being detected. And there is an energy they exude which creates a fascination. And added to that, I think what happens is a lot of people crowd the court. And we've seen this, by the way, with this case of the guy who shot the health insurance chief executive in the street and was picked up. And then he suddenly has a fan club. I mean, fan clubs for serial killers, you're right, I'll never get my head around. But I think it's because once you are attracted and fascinated, you can make a case that this person is innocent. And I think often when you find the person who's, Ted Bundy's, Carol Ann Boone is an example of this, actually. She absolutely believed he was being stitched up and framed. She wouldn't accept any of the evidence that was taken, even the bite marks, whatever they had, couldn't accept it. And so she created this whole different narrative, and I think that's probably it. I used to write to a guy on death row, actually, when I was in my 20s, because I felt that, in those days I thought capital punishment was really in the States was really a bad thing, and I interviewed some people who were campaigning against it, and I was kind of taken with them, and I said, could I correspond with somebody? And I managed to have a correspondence with him about, the price of fish without ever really talking about his crime or inquiring. And, maybe we can talk about this separately so I suppose I'm answering this question as myself. Why did I correspond with someone who turned out to have killed a woman? And I think I just was a bit idealistic in my 20s, and I thought, this guy's going to be executed and I'll give him a crumb of comfort. But I had an American friend who said, have you ever thought about his victim? And I do think about that now. I think, why did I do that without? And the answer is that actually the people who put me in touch with him said, don't ask about the crime. So for quite a while when I was corresponding with him, I didn't know what he'd done. And that suited both of us. And then I found out, and quite soon after, he was executed, actually. So his name was Ronald E. Hoke. And he was not a serial killer. He killed one person, and that's bad enough.
It is overwhelming women that write to people in jail. I mean, it's overwhelming women that come to my crime shows. And I'm often asked, why are women more fascinated in crime than the men? And I think that's because women are they want to understand people more than men. Men tend to kind of like deal with it in the moment and then move on. But women want to understand, why is it a man's done that? And of course, as a part of that understanding of the psychology, the mindset enables them to start to kind of like break down some of those barriers. And I think when they try to break down those barriers, because the reality is that, I always talk about this, is that, all of the most dangerous people I've dealt with, serial killers, offenders, is they are not nasty through and through. There is very nice parts about them. They're not horrible all the time. And in fact, as a result of them, very, very horrible, nasty people don't commit multiple crimes because they get caught very quickly, because there's no buy-in to that aspect of it. So what you've got is that manipulation of males in terms of over the females. And why do females stay with domestic violence offenders? I mean, there's a whole interesting psychology there that draws female victims into male offenders.
Yeah, I mean, I think someone who commits a murder in January can't possibly be a good person in February, because if he's a good person in February, he'll give himself up. So I think he's only pretending to be a good person. So I've got a much darker view of the human spirit. I think some people are truly wicked, and I think the reason that women are fascinated by this more than men, which I guess makes me an exception somehow, but I think it's because women are overall victims. They're overwhelmingly the victims. Somebody told me that they were, it was a friend of theirs who was an academic, and in his lecture theatre, he had 150 students, roughly 50-50 split. And he said, all right, just before we get on with the lecture, I want you to get up from your seats and I want you to walk over to that wall. If at any point today or yesterday, you've made a decision about what you do based on your desire to avoid sexual violence. So you go and stand over there. And if you haven't, stand over there. And he said every single man stood over there and every single woman stood at the other side. And the blokes all like, bloody hell, what's going on? And a lot of us don't clock it. The feeling, why do women get told not to walk alone at night? What's the problem? And I think these cases help us understand that. I mean, this guy is your worst nightmare. And I see, when I've seen the programs about Bundy, I always am struck. The girls were very young. They were 20, 22, 23. Always killed blonde women with their hair parted in the middle. That was his chosen victim. And they would just vanish. And then they'd be found. And then he would return. He'd shampoo their hair. He'd put makeup on them. He'd rape them after death, etc. He'd keep going back until the wolves ate their bodies. And the mum is probably 45. And she's got to live with that for the next 40 years. So the cruelty is incredible. So when he smiles at me and I'm in the coffee shop and he's buying a cup of coffee, that's not a good person there. He's pretending to be good.
You don't see that. That's the thing. They live amongst us. That's the problem, is that, of course, I think for, you talk to the analogy used in the university, females suffer, sexual violence, comments every single day. You know, those are aspects. And I think as males, we don't necessarily understand that. I remember I did a sexual offence when I was in the police service. I was a sexual offences trained officer, and that meant that you'd work with those people who have been victims of sexual abuse, whatever it was. And I remember we had a training session, and it was a person that came and gave a lecture, and they showed this video, and they were talking about it in terms of, as a man, do you think you're vulnerable? Do you think you're vulnerable as a man in terms of sexual abuse? And I remember thinking to myself, you know, I'm big guy, strong guys, thinking, well, no, you know, I don't feel that in any way at all. And they played this video, and this was video of this American police officer, and he basically was isolated down a lane, and he was horrifically sexually abused. And it was a very powerful video. And I came away afterwards, and I remember thinking to myself, do you know what? For the very first time, the penny has really dropped. And actually, do you know what? We actually are all vulnerable, but we're vulnerable in different ways because, of course, we have physical strength on our side, which is very different to what a female has. And so there is a different challenge there. But the way that people deal with crimes afterwards, whilst I was doing this sexual offences course, there's a lady that came in, and I'll never forget her. I don't know if you remember the Ealing Vicarage rapists.
Of course I do. Jane Seward, yeah.
She came in. She came in and talked to us, right? And she sat there and she told us the story. So effectively, these people break into the vicarage. Her parents, her father, I think it was her father was the vicar, and obviously the vicar's wife, Michael, was mum, came in and they committed a burglary, but they also committed the most horrific rape. And that took place. And I remember her sitting and telling us the story. And I literally, it was a moment of the most horrific, but she told it in such a way. And I remember one of the questions I said to ask afterwards, and I said to her, do you not feel do you feel angry at them? Do you hate them? You know, what's your feeling towards them? And she actually met up with them in the years afterwards. Yeah, they come out. She actually met up with them and spoke to them. And they explained why they did it and what they did. And I remember thinking to myself, do you know what? If that can happen to you and you still have the ability to communicate with somebody on that level, absolutely incredible. But I think one of the things that it tells me is that the brutality out there are horrible people that live amongst us. And I think, you know, the male race have a lot to answer for in terms of the offences that get carried out. And you know, when someone talks about the misogyny that exists in the police service, when someone, you know, talks about intimidating women, the violence to women, I tell you what, you are a pathetic man if you feel that your way is to use violence against a woman.
Of course, I agree with that. And it was Jill Sayward, I remember now, and her father was Michael, and he wrote hymns and stuff, and he gave interviews about what had happened. And the thing that he said was he'd always thought that maybe an act of physical violence was the same as an act of sexual violence, and that against his daughter made him realize that there was a massive gulf between the two. And what had happened to his daughter was the most serious crime that anyone could suffer short of murder. But there's a postscript to Bundy, which just shows the level of tolerance you have when someone is plausible and wears a tie, which is that when he was convicted of his murders and sentenced to death, the judge made quite a famous speech. And the judge said, you know, you're a bright young man, and I know you wanted to be a lawyer, and I sure as hell would have liked to see you practicing in this court. But you took the wrong turn, buddy, and I'm sorry about that. And it's almost like they're talking over a beer. And people then, at the time, nowadays, if that happened, people would go mad. It's like, excuse me, what about the victims? But even at that moment of conviction, the judge thought, oh, I like this guy. Is that incredible?
He became quite a cult figure, didn't he? I mean, if you look on the internet, the photographs of him, the way that he presents himself. I mean, I actually have to say that in today's world, wrongly, I think Ted Bundy has become a bit of a cult figure.
For sure. And I think, you know, he was on the up in the Republican Party. And I would recommend for further reading for our listeners and viewers who've not really come across him, there's a documentary called Conversations with a Killer, Ted Bundy, which I saw on Netflix. And that is a remarkable work by two journalists who got access to him, and he was very manipulative, and he's also a liar, so you can't really tell whether anything he says is true. He doesn't want to admit any crimes. And they said, okay, well, look, let's try this. If you were the murderer, how would you have done it? And at that point, the taps just opened, and he just talked about every single crime. And it's chilling, but it is, thankfully, I don't think we'll see his like again, because of forensics and the fact that police forces are not as inept as they were. Anyway, that's Bundy. That will probably not be the last time we talk about him either, Mark, will it? Who are we doing next week?
So this is a case that's reared itself again, and quite rightly so, because the actions of the police officer, which are tantamount to unbelievable, really. We always talk in terms of victims and respect, and the one people that should be giving victims a respect to the police. But when they let you down, you have to question the morality of society as a whole. And this is the very tragic murder of 18-year-old Sally Ann Bowman.
Right, we're going to talk about her. We'll talk about the killer, Mark Dixie. It's a case that's a good few years ago, but it's a particularly important murder case. But it's come back into the news because of the actions of an awful rogue officer, which we'll talk about. Well, as always, Mark, thank you for your conversation about Ted Bundy today. My God, that is hard to squeeze his crimes into half an hour, that's for sure.
Yeah, as always, Jeremy, very, very interesting. And I do think these are cases that the public are fascinated by. And what we must never lose sight of is, yes, we remember the name of the offender, but let's remember that they leave behind them victims, and victims who have a life sentence.
With that in mind, I will just say the name of what we think was his last victim, which was the 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, by which stage he knew he was going to be caught, and he was just killing anybody he came across. He lost all of his targeting that he was doing before. So Kimberly Leach, who was summoned to school by a teacher to retrieve a purse she'd forgotten, and she just disappeared on her way back to school. And there we go. All right, next time then, it's the murder of Sally Ann Bowman and Mark Dixie.
Thank you.
Thanks all. See you soon.